So I will tell you that sometimes I hear passages like the one that was just read and think, where did that Jesus come from? Because the Jesus who says you must turn away from, you must hate your family, just give up all your possessions, just pick up a cross to follow me, is not the Jesus I remember from Sunday school. The Jesus I remember from Sunday school is the one who says, let the children come to me. The one that talks about love and compassion and feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. That's the Jesus I like to listen to. And I think when I hear passages like the one that was just read, I think, can we just go back to that other one? It's much easier. And maybe that's the point. At this point in Luke's gospel, Jesus is on a journey to Jerusalem and the end of his life on a cross. He's been preaching for about 3 years, and his closest followers are with him, and he's been telling them repeatedly, if we've been reading consecutively through Luke, he's been telling them quite regularly that trouble is up ahead. They're heading for danger. Jesus is reading the signs around him and has been saying, you have to start paying attention. And instead, the disciples have been wandering around going, now how do you think we're going to feed this crowd of 5,000 people? Or, you know, the whole banquet story, Jesus, we didn't quite get that one. Could you tell it again? Because we don't really understand what you were saying in that one. So it might be that when Jesus says to the crowd around him on that day, you must turn away from your family, you must hate your family, you must pick up a cross, you must lose your life to gain it, you must give away all your possessions, it might have struck the disciples as a little strange as well. And they might have been wondering, where did this Jesus come from? Tom Wright is a bishop in the Church of England and an author, and he says that in his comments about this passage, he says, if Jesus is trying to gather a bunch of followers, this is quite possibly the worst advertising campaign in human history. Come join us, hate your friends and family, and turn away from everything you know. It'll be great. It's not going to work. And then Tom Wright says, maybe we need to think about this in a slightly different light. Think about what Jesus is actually doing in this passage. He says, what if we imagine Jesus as the leader of an expedition into the high mountains, a rescue mission? He says, what if we think about Jesus that way? And what if we think about the team that's going with Jesus has just reached a high mountain pass, and they're about to go through, and Jesus stops and turns to the team and says, by the way, this next stretch may be beyond some of your abilities. It's going to be really tough, and I can't guarantee you're going to be safe. I'm going. You're welcome to come with me, but you need to know the risks. And if you're coming, you're going to need to leave your packs here. Send a goodbye message to your families, because we need to focus on what's ahead, not on where we've been. I read that this week and thought, okay, I might be able to go with that. That makes it a little easier to sit with this passage. I still don't particularly like it, but at least it makes it a little more, okay, not quite like I have to turn away from my family and friends, because like many of you, I suspect, it has never been hard for me to follow Jesus. I grew up in Canada, where freedom of religion is part of the law here, where Christianity has been the dominant religion for centuries. And I'll tell you, I'm a third-generation preacher, so church was our family business, which meant we talked about it at supper every night, which drove my sister to distraction because she didn't go into the church, but we talked about it anyway. And it was in everything we did. So it wasn't particularly hard. I grew up in Southern Ontario, where in small towns where church was still central to the community life. And following Jesus didn't feel like I had to turn away from my family because they were all there. And I didn't have to give up all my possessions, and I didn't have to pick up a cross. It was easy as a child to be part of church and figure I was following Jesus. So the passage doesn't quite sit right with me yet, because it doesn't feel like I've had to sacrifice a whole lot in my life to follow Jesus. And yet that seems to be what Jesus is saying. So I want to go back to the crowd that he's talking to for a few minutes. I want to think about who some of those people in the crowd were. There were the 12 that Jesus has called, his inner circle, his disciples. Jesus has called them, and they've been with him for the whole 3 years. But as he's journeying towards Jerusalem, it seems like the crowd keeps getting bigger and bigger. And so as this crowd gets bigger, I don't think Jesus would have used these words, but I have a suspicion that there may be some early adopters in that crowd. You know what an early adopter, I'm assuming you know what this is, but I'm going to tell you anyway in case you don't. So an early adopter is one of those people who sees the ad for the newest iPhone, pre-orders it, and then stands in line for 48 hours outside Best Buy, so they're the first ones in the store to get the iPhone, and they have it before anybody else does. That's the early adopter. My suspicion is that some of the people in that crowd around Jesus that day when he said, you must turn away from family, pick up a cross, and give up all your possessions, my suspicion is that some of the people in that crowd were early adopters. And I think Jesus knew it. And they were there because Jesus was the latest new sensation. And they wanted to see what it was because they didn't want to miss out. So there they are in the crowd. And the thing is that Jesus is standing there going, you need to know this is not the latest iPhone. That's not what this is. This is a movement. If you choose to follow me, your life will change. That's what this is. And so he says to them, turn away from family, pick up a cross, give up everything you have. If you can't make that kind of a choice to follow me, you should probably go find the next iPhone. And I think that's where it comes to for us in this passage. It's not actually about the cross and the family and the possessions. I think what we can get out of this passage is about the choice. I'll tell you that after growing up in Southern Ontario, where church was the central part of our lives, when I went to theological school, I did have a sense that the world around us was starting to change. So I grew up in Southern Ontario in small towns. By the time I was in high school, we had moved to Brampton, which is on the outer edges of, at that time, on the outer edges of Toronto. And there was a lot of immigration in Brampton. But the immigration that we had when I was first there was Italian. So it's still Christians, they just happened to be Catholic. And so I knew the world was shifting, but I wasn't too worried about it. By the time I graduated and was ordained in 1995, there were starting to be conversations in academic circles and around the edges of the church about what the future held for us. Because people were starting to feel like maybe things were shifting. The training that I got as a minister was from mainline Protestant denomination perspective, where, like the churches I grew up in as a child, church was central to the society around it. So the training I got was from a church that believed that it had a lot to say to the government, that the things it did was to work for the good of society, and that being a good Christian was pretty much the same thing as being a good citizen. That was the world that I was trained for. And that's about 25 years ago. I will tell you that that is not the world we live in. You may have already noticed that. It's a nice world. A lot of us still look back on it and wish it would return. It's not coming back. We're in a very different place. And so when Jesus says to the crowd, it talks about making a choice, I think we can hear that here as well. Because I already mentioned it at the beginning, but you made a choice to be here this morning instead of at the Queen City Marathon or instead of at Starbucks. And these days, coming to church on a Sunday morning is a choice that we make. It is not the norm in society, and that's okay. We just need to know that it's a choice we're making. I will tell you that the times when it has not been easy to follow Jesus are the times when I have not been in ministry. So I've kind of rotated in and out of ministry at various times in my life. My children are 16 and 19 now. I was ordained in 95, and my first son was born in 1999, and I left my settlement charge, which was in Ogama, Saskatchewan, in 2000, to go with my husband and my son to Humboldt. And I worked for a few years in Humboldt, and then my second son was born, and I took some time off for ministry, and then I went to Ontario and was a minister there for a year. And then because of my husband's job, we actually returned to Regina, and I was with Rosemont until they closed in 2012. And I will say that feeling like I was following Jesus has always been easy when I've been in ministry, because we are surrounded by the thoughts and the culture when we're inside the building. It gets harder when I'm not in ministry, and I have not been in active full-time ministry since 2012. So Ken said in his introduction this morning that I am the head of the Conservatory of Performing Arts at the University of Regina, and it's in those moments when I'm at work that I find I struggle the most with figuring out, how do you do this? Like, how do you take the stuff we talk about on Sunday morning out into the rest of the week and make it stick? Because I will tell you, it is very easy in the work world that I am in to get caught up in making sure that we make the budget, or in treating the employees as cogs in a great machine instead of human beings. And I somehow don't think that's what Jesus would be saying we should be doing if he was sitting by my shoulder giving me advice. And it's hard. That's where it gets hard. It's not hard here, where we're all, well, it might be hard if the budget is tough, but kind of assures us we're in good financial shape, so we're okay here. It is a good island to be on. It's a good place to come and get strengthened up, because outside the walls, outside this community here, is where we might run into things where we do have conflict with family, where we might run into things like, oh, what do we do with that? And if I choose, it's like I said, it's very easy to slide into that business mentality when I'm at work and ignore the things that I talk about or think about on Sunday mornings. And if I do that, what I find is that I'm picking up the society cross. It's not the cross Jesus says to pick up. We can talk about that another day, but it's the society cross, and it's a cross of distrust, of greed, of overwork, of being exhausted, of not quite knowing if you're ever safe. When you pick up that cross, it's hard to also think about picking up the cross of Jesus. Think of following him where he's going. So like I said, I don't have the answer. I wish there was an easy answer to say, I choose to follow Jesus. That's where you need an easy button, right? I choose to follow Jesus, and it just sticks. I haven't figured out the secret to making it stick all the time. What I do know is that when I choose today to follow Jesus, if I can take that into tomorrow and choose to follow Jesus tomorrow as well, what I will find is that I am being led by someone who cares enough to say, Krista, it might be tough going out there, but you can choose to follow. And he will continue to lead as we go out into that week.